Marcus Wynn was 39 years old the night four men walked up his driveway in the dark, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. To look at him, you would not have worried. He was a quiet man. He drove a 17 F-150 with a cracked side mirror he kept meaning to replace. His neighbors in Charlotte's West Boulevard corridor knew him as the one who left for work before sunrise and came home smelling like sawdust and machine oil. He coached Little League on Saturdays and waved when he drove past. His wife Trisha's friends called him Marcus the Machine. Not unkindly, they said, but meaning he was steady and dependable and not particularly exciting. Trisha laughed when they said it. She never corrected them. What none of them knew, not Trisha, not her friends, not the man she had been meeting at the Residence Inn on South Tryon for 11 months, was what Marcus had done before Charlotte. Before the carpentry business, before the wedding, before any of it. He had spent 8 years with SEAL Team 4, including 2 full deployments in places whose names he was not at liberty to say. He had been extracted from a burning vehicle in a country that did not officially have American forces in it. He had carried a man twice his size on his back through 2 miles of mountain terrain in the dark. He had been trained specifically, precisely, and at enormous taxpayer expense to remain calm when everything around him was on fire. He had walked away from that life at 31, built something quiet with his hands, invested $247,000 into a carpentry and renovation business that had tripled in the 3 years before that Tuesday night. Trisha had no idea any of that money existed. She had no idea what was about to happen when those 4 men came up the driveway. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning that everything began to unravel started like every other morning on Meadowbrook Drive. The April light came through the kitchen windows at a low angle and caught the tile Marcus had laid himself, a herringbone pattern in white and sand that had taken him 3 weekends and more patience than he'd expected. He stood at the counter with his coffee cradled in both hands, watching the way the light moved across it. He had laid every tile flush. Not a single one was off by more than a 1/16 of an inch. His grandfather, the man who taught him the trade before the Navy took him, used to say that if you were too impatient to set a tile right, you were too impatient for this work. He had carried that with him into everything he built. He had built a lot since coming home. The carpentry operation Marcus ran out of a workshop behind the house employed 4 men full-time. He specialized in restoration work, historic homes, old wood rescued from structures being torn down and given new purpose. There was a dignity to it that appealed to him. Taking something broken and making it whole again required a particular kind of attention. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force it. You moved slowly, with both eyes open, and you let the material tell you what it needed. The coffee was still hot when Trisha came downstairs. She was already dressed, which was new. She used to move through mornings slowly, always running a few minutes behind. These days she was up and moving before he finished his first cup. She kissed his cheek, a quick touch, practiced, on the side closest to the door, and reached past him for her keys on the hook by the refrigerator. "Early meeting," she said, without him asking. He nodded. "I'll lock up." She smiled. It was a complete and correct smile, the kind that used a full set of facial muscles. He noticed she was wearing the perfume he hadn't bought her. He had met Trisha 8 years ago at a mutual friend's cookout in the Druid Hills neighborhood. She had been standing by herself near a live oak tree, reading the label on a bottle of hot sauce, with the same focused attention most people gave their phones. And something about that made him walk over. They talked until the food was gone, and the evening turned cool. She had been sharp and funny and comfortable in her own company, and he'd thought right then that this was a woman who didn't need a room to love her to feel okay. He had married that woman. He was not entirely certain who this one was, but he was patient. He was always patient. That morning, after she left, he stood in the kitchen and looked at the tile for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee and went to the workshop. And for 5 minutes before his crew arrived, he was very still and very quiet, in the way he had once been still and quiet in places with no names. The first signal came at noon. A notification from the doorbell camera he had installed the previous October after a neighbor's truck was broken into. He had forgotten it was there, honestly. The app on his phone vibrated during his lunch break. A car he didn't recognize, a silver Lexus, newer, had pulled to the curb in front of the house and idled for 90 seconds before pulling away. He watched the footage twice. The plate was visible. He put his phone in his shirt pocket and went back to work. He didn't go looking for anything that first day. He was not impulsive, and he was not a fool. His commanding officer at BUD/S had told him once that when you moved too early, you got a lie. When you waited, you got the truth. He had never forgotten it. The truth came 4 days later, and it was not subtle. He had driven home early on a Friday. A material delivery had fallen through, and the day was effectively over at 2 in the afternoon. He came up the back way, through the alley, and parked in the workshop rather than the driveway. Force of habit, probably, or something else he didn't examine too closely. The silver Lexus was at the curb. He did not go inside. He sat in the workshop, and he was very still. He heard the door to the house open and close 40 minutes later. He heard a man's voice, low and assured, saying something that didn't carry clearly through the wall. He heard Tricia laugh, a real laugh, loose and unguarded, the kind she used to direct at him. He heard the Lexus start. He waited another 12 minutes before going into the house. His hands were not shaking. His face was arranged in its usual calm expression. He set his keys on the hook and looked at the kitchen tile and breathed once through his nose. Then he went to his laptop. He had kept separate accounts since before they married, not out of suspicion, just as a structural habit his financial advisor had recommended. And Tricia had access to the joint account they used for household expenses. He pulled up the statements for the last 14 months. He moved through them methodically, the way he had once moved through technical intelligence reports, building a picture from fragments. What he found was not dramatic. It never was. It was small and steady and patient. The same $800 transferred out every 2 weeks to an account he didn't recognize, starting 11 months ago. Small enough not to trigger a flag, consistent enough to tell a story. He cross-referenced dates with his own travel records and found that 22 of the transfers had occurred on days when he was out of town on a job. $17,600. Not life-changing money. That wasn't the point. The point was the precision, the planning, the fact that someone had thought carefully about what wouldn't be noticed. His face remained perfectly calm. He forwarded the bank records to his personal email address, opened a new folder on his laptop, and named it simply Tricia. Then he drove back to the workshop and sat with the stillness for a while longer. He looked the plate up through a contact he still had from his earlier life. The Lexus was registered to a man named Derek Paulson, 44 years old, a real estate broker with an office in South End. He pulled the professional profile. Expensive suit in the photo, smile that suggested he considered himself formidable. Marcus studied it the way he had once studied the profiles of people who required a very different kind of attention. He picked up his phone and called one number. "Walter," he said when the older man answered, "I need to sit down with you this week." Walter Brims was 67 years old, a retired civil rights attorney who had known Marcus's grandfather and treated Marcus like a nephew since the day he came back from the service. He operated out of a cluttered office above a barber shop on Beatty's Ford Road, where he still took cases 2 days a week and never charged what he was worth. He listened to everything Marcus laid on the small table between them without interrupting once. When Marcus finished, Walter leaned back in his chair and pulled his reading glasses down to look at the bank statements properly. He was quiet for a long time. "You have more somewhere," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And the business accounts?" "Separate, always. She doesn't have access." Walter nodded slowly. "Then your exposure is limited. The joint account is recoverable under North Carolina statute if we can establish the transfers were unauthorized or coercive." He set the glasses down. "We need a family law attorney. I'm going to call Patricia Okafor. She's the one you want for this." "What about the man?" "Derek Paulson." Walter said the name like he was holding it at arm's length. "He's a real estate broker. If he's been involved in the financial movement, even advising it, there are civil angles. Patricia will see them." He looked at Marcus steadily. "You don't need to do anything dramatic here, son. The quieter you move, the more you get." Marcus nodded. "Your grandfather said something to me once," Walter continued. "He said the man who builds with both eyes open never gets surprised by the shape of what he's made. You remember he used to say that?" Marcus was quiet a beat. "Yeah, I remember." He drove home that evening and ate dinner across from Tricia, and answered her questions about the Pemberton project, and watched her eyes, and gave nothing away. She poured herself a glass of wine. She showed him something funny on her phone. He smiled at the right moments. Some performances required their own kind of discipline. He was one of the better performers in that room. Patricia Okafor was 49 years old, precise, and dressed like she expected to be taken seriously before she opened her mouth. She reviewed Marcus's documentation across a conference table and made notes in a legal pad with a deliberateness that reminded him of a very careful surgeon. By the end of that meeting, they had established 3 things. The $17,600 in transfers was small but documented and traceable. More significantly, Patricia had requested and received, through a mutual professional contact, a look at Derek Paulson's recent real estate transactions. 2 properties had been sold in the previous year at below-market values to a holding company with a registered agent address that appeared on 3 other documents, including the transfer account where Tricia's withdrawals had landed. It was not simple adultery. It had the shape of something more calculated. She was parking assets, Patricia said. She didn't say it with judgment, just notation. "How much are we talking about?" "The properties? Combined value is approximately $380,000. If she was moving equity out of marital assets through a third party, which this could be argued to represent, you have grounds to claw that back, or a significant portion." She set her pen down. "But I need to ask you something directly. Is there anything about your background or finances that would complicate this?" Marcus looked at her levelly. "I have a business worth approximately $800,000 in current valuation. It predates the marriage by 2 years and was never commingled with joint accounts. I have documentation for all of it." Patricia studied him for a moment. "She doesn't know this." "No. And what else doesn't she know?" He told her about the service, the deployments, the training. She wrote something in her notepad, and for the first time since they'd sat down, something close to a smile moved across her face. "Good," she said simply. That becomes relevant Saturday. Because by then, they had learned about Saturday. Walter's contact in Paulson's building had seen Paulson on his phone the previous week, speaking with some agitation, and had caught fragments, enough to understand that something was being planned for Marcus's address that coming weekend, when Marcus was supposed to be in Raleigh for a job. The contact described the call as a man planning to make a point. He had mentioned bringing people. Marcus canceled the Raleigh job quietly, told no one he'd done so, and rearranged Saturday. He spent Friday evening in the workshop, running his hands over a piece of reclaimed heart pine he was saving for a particular project. Real power operated in quiet rooms. He had always known that. The men who made the most noise were almost always the most afraid. He was not afraid. He had simply started the clock. They came at 8:43 on a Saturday evening. Marcus knew from the camera, the same doorbell camera that had started all of this, that there were 4 of them. Paulson and 3 others he didn't recognize. They parked 2 cars down and came up the driveway with the energy of men who had decided in advance how this was going to go. Tricia was not home. She was at her sister's and had been encouraged in that direction by a text from her sister that Tricia didn't know had been composed with Walter's input. There was no need for her to witness what was coming. There was also no legal advantage to having her present. Marcus stepped out onto the porch as they crossed the lawn. Paulson was in front. He was taller than his professional photo suggested, and he had the posture of a man who used height as punctuation. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, with his 3 companions spread out behind him, like he had thought carefully about the visual. "Marcus Wynne," he said, not a question. "That's right." Marcus's voice was entirely level. He had his hands in his pockets, and his weight distributed evenly, and his expression was the same one he wore when he was pricing a restoration job. "You've been asking questions about me," Paulson said. "I don't appreciate that." "I imagine you don't." One of the men behind Paulson, shorter, built wide through the shoulders, took 1 step forward onto the bottom porch stair. Marcus's eyes moved to him and stayed there for exactly 2 seconds. The man stopped. "Here's what's going to happen," Paulson said. He had a smooth delivery, rehearsed. "You're going to stop whatever you think you're doing, you're going to sign what Patricia Okafor sends you, and you're going to do it without any more noise. That's the simple version." "And the complicated version?" Marcus asked. Paulson glanced at the 3 men behind him. The implication was clear enough. Marcus looked at him with the same calm attention he had given everything for the past 3 weeks. The tile, the bank statements, the documents spread across Patricia's conference table. He let the silence sit for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I want to make sure you understand something before this goes any further," Marcus said quietly. "Because I think you came here with a set of assumptions about who you were dealing with, and I'd rather correct those assumptions now than have you make a decision you can't walk back from." Paulson's expression shifted just slightly. "What assumptions?" "That I'm a carpenter." Marcus let that sit for a beat. "I am a carpenter. But before that, I spent 8 years with SEAL Team 4. I have been in situations that make this porch look like a school play. The 3 men you brought with you, I clocked them from the camera before you parked. The big one on your left favors his right knee. The one on the stair telegraphs when he's about to move. And the one in the back hasn't committed to being here at all. He's been looking at the street twice a minute since you stopped moving." No one said anything. "I'm not going to do anything to any of you tonight," Marcus continued. "That's not what this is. But I want you to understand the full picture before you make a choice." He reached inside the front door and produced a manila envelope. He walked down the 2 porch steps without hurrying and held it out to Paulson. Paulson took it, slowly, and opened it. Inside was a copy of the property transaction records, the holding company registration, the transfer account statements, a letter from Patricia Okafor addressed to Derek Paulson's Real Estate License Board, and a second letter from a forensic accountant Walter had engaged, detailing the clawback exposure. Paulson's face changed. The smooth delivery dissolved somewhere around the second page. "That's a copy," Marcus said. "The originals have been filed. The licensing board letter goes out Monday morning, unless Patricia hears from your attorney by end of business Sunday. The forensic accountant's report goes to the district attorney's office Tuesday regardless." The man on the bottom stair had stepped back down to the lawn. The one in the back had already drifted a full foot closer to the street. Paulson looked up from the papers. "You should have asked Tricia more questions," Marcus said, and his voice was not cruel about it, just clear. "She didn't ask me enough either. That was the error. Both of you made it." He turned and walked back up the 2 steps and through his front door and closed it behind him, and he did not look back. The porch was silent behind him. He walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter and looked at the tile he had laid himself, flush and even and right, and the coffee he'd left there was cold, and he poured it out and made a new cup and stood in the quiet of the house he had built into what it was, and he breathed once through his nose, and he was still. He was done. 7 months passed like water through a good, clean channel. The licensing board did open a review of Derek Paulson's real estate practice. 2 of his recent transactions were flagged for irregular valuation and subsequently audited. His license was suspended pending review, and the civil action Patricia Okafor pursued on Marcus's behalf resulted in a judgment that recovered the transferred funds along with a portion of the property equity. A total of $212,000 returned to Marcus's documented assets. The divorce was finalized in 4 months, cleanly, with no contested provisions of significance. Tricia had not found an attorney who could argue effectively against the documentation Marcus had assembled. Walter told Marcus what happened to Paulson afterward in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. Lost the South End office. Moved operations to a smaller market out of state. One of the 3 men who had come up the driveway had apparently wanted nothing further to do with the enterprise after that Saturday night, which Walter considered a reasonable response. As for Tricia, Marcus heard through the sisters' network that she had relocated to a 2-bedroom apartment in the university area and taken a position doing administrative work for a property management company. He registered this information and moved on from it in the same motion. He did not gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. Something that had once been good had revealed itself to be otherwise, and he had handled it and was finished with it. The workshop behind the new house. He had purchased a property in the Belmont neighborhood with the structured financing Patricia had recommended, was larger than the last one, with better light in the mornings. He had laid the floor himself in reclaimed white oak that still carried the warmth of whatever building it had originally been part of. He had planted a garden along the south wall in March, not for any particular reason, just because things grew better with attention. A woman named Celeste came into his life the way things did when a man stopped performing and started simply being himself. She was a structural engineer for a firm that specialized in historic preservation. They had met on a restoration job, and she had walked through the building asking questions no one had thought to ask, and Marcus had stood back and watched her work and thought that he recognized something in that kind of attention. She was not at the center of his life, she was present in it, which was different and considerably better. On a Tuesday morning in November, Marcus stood in the workshop doorway with a cup of coffee and watched the light come through the new windows he had framed himself. Celeste was at the kitchen table behind him, reading something. Outside, the Japanese maple he had planted in October had turned fully red, and the color of it against the pale morning was the kind of thing that didn't need to be said about. He thought of his grandfather. He thought of a tile set, flush and level and right. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. And the ones who forgot to ask the right questions would never understand why. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.